Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I came across a study that I wanted to share with all of you. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And the reason this study is important is because it's about ketones and cancer cells. Now, I have personally said in the past that ketogenic diets, there was some promising research showing that ketogenic diets might be useful when concurrent with other therapies for treating cancer. There needs to be a lot more research being done, but this was a very strong possibility. And the reason I had said that is because we know that circulating IGF-1 and circulating insulin seems to be the primary growth factor for cancer cells, meaning that the cancer cells suck this stuff up. They're extremely insulin sensitive. Cancer cells tend to be. So ketogenic diets might be a method to reduce food to them, to help starve them a little bit when concurrent with other treatments. Because ketogenic diets do slightly lower total circulating insulin. Now, I've said in the past that diet isn't always the primary method here, that the best way to do a lot of this is to have a lot of muscle mass. We know that carrying more muscle mass is one of the best preventers of cancer, all right? We know that being morbidly obese, and again, not bodybuilder obese, I'm talking real morbid obesity, and that doesn't mean by body weight, because obviously a bodybuilder who's 250 pounds and using a bunch of steroids to get there has an enormous amount of muscle mass, not body fat. So what we're talking about is people who have 50 or more pounds of excess body fat are at a much, much higher risk of cancer. Again, it's partially due to insulin resistance. Anyone who has any sort of insulin resistance, or what's also called metabolic syndrome, which tends to go hand in hand with being morbidly obese for a while, too much body fat. Again, this gets blurred lines when we start talking about body weight versus body fat, and it's only because there are people out there, particularly due to anabolic use, who have a lot of muscle mass. More so, enough so that they could be considered obese even when they're not. And while that might matter for certain cardiovascular phenomenon, for cancer purposes, there's a significant difference there, because we know that the more fat you have, the higher risk you are of getting cancer when it's above the normal range, meaning someone who's ultra lean doesn't necessarily have a lower risk than someone who's 15%. But if you're sitting at 30% body fat as a male or 35% as a female, you're simply at a much higher risk of cancer, right? And having more muscle mass lowers that. But this has to do with circulating insulin. It has to do with insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, all of that. And it had been speculated that ketogenic diets could help with this. Well, unfortunately, we've got studies now finding that a lot of types of cancer cells secrete ketones, and it feeds the adjacent cells. That we are finding now that cancer cells can readily use ketones as a fuel source. Well, what does that mean? That means that anyone who's got a large amount of circulating ketones, even if they don't have a large amount of circulating glucose and insulin, could be at just as much risk, meaning their cancer cells are going to potentially grow just as fast. That cancer cells, at least some types of them, seem to be able to feed on ketones very easily as a fuel source. And that's something that was speculated to not be possible in the past because they seem to have a high insulin sensitivity. Well, apparently cancer cells will eat anything that you give them. So the problem here, the really big problem, is going to be ketogenic diets produce large amounts of ketones. Yeah, there's less circulating insulin, but they're just providing a different fuel source for the cancer. Even worse, this is one of the reasons this is going to be really bad, is going to be that morbidly obese people are basically screwed if they get cancer, because they're already at a higher risk of cancer. Well, even when they start losing weight, and that's the thing that people need to understand. They're like, well, these cancer victims are skinny. Yeah, because they lose weight. Doesn't mean they weren't fat when they first got it. Well, the issue you're going to run into here is that even when the morbidly obese start losing weight, when they have cancer cells already, what happens? Rapid weight loss tends to produce a lot of ketones in the bloodstream. Sure, it lowers IGF-1 levels. That's good to fight the cancer, but if there's a tons of circulating ketones, we still might not be any better off. So ketogenic diets being an actual viable method to help treat cancer might not be all they're cracked up to be. And it's probably going to vary from cancer type to cancer type, just like with different things. We found certain cancers are more insulin driven than others. We'll probably find the same thing with ketones, but it is now scary when we're seeing that there are cancer cells that can just suck up ketones just as easily as they suck up glucose. That they readily use it and burn it as a fuel source. And if they have access to it for fuel, they're going to be able to grow. So ketogenic diets, as far as being a cancer preventative, might not be that beneficial. In fact, it's looking quite the opposite in this case. Furthermore, people who are selling ketone supplements, that's been the latest craze now. Ketones. Let's do all these ketone supplements, because ketones were being touted as injecting ketones might be a viable method to help treat cancer. It needed more research, but there was some data showing it might be promising. Well, if we now have cancer types that we find can use ketones, injecting ketones could cause the opposite effect. What about supplementing ketones? Because I've seen some people out there saying, well, because of this potential negative link between ketones and cancer, which was not proven, this was speculative, it needed a lot more research. And like I said before, it was promising, and I was very, very, what's the term I'm looking for? Had a very positive attitude about it. I'm like, well, hey, ketogenic diets might not be the best for overall health. They're not perfect, but, they do have some medical applications. And if it turns out they're viable for helping to treat cancer, that means that they have a very viable medical role. So I was very optimistic about this. But now I might have to take back my optimism. I might have been wrong. It might not be as prospective and beneficial as we had previously hoped for. Particularly when they're proving in labs that we have cancer cells that can utilize ketones for fuel. That's a very bad thing. And here's the problem. So now people have been taking these supplements, and some companies out there are speculating, well, hey, if these ketones can be used to help treat cancer, supplementing with ketones might be good, other than it's just going to help feed cancer cells, just as easily as if you just consumed a bunch of sugar. So people who are utilizing these instead of sugary things and glucose-based drinks for training fuel, because, the sugar could be feeding cancer and other problems, well, the ketones could be doing the same thing. We're not any better off. So if anyone's consuming these ketone supplements in the hopes that, well, it might be better for preventing cancer if I consume these expensive ketone supplements instead of a glucose-based drink to fuel my workouts on, because eating rice is really hard to do, I guess. Finding plenty of starches to fuel your training seems to be difficult for some people. I guess they haven't heard of rice. They haven't heard of pasta. So they think they have to use supplements to train on. Well, they're shooting themselves in the foot here, because it's looking like ketones can feed cancer just as well as glucose does. So that's really a problem. And hopefully, with this data coming out, more people are going to look at this and be like, well, wait a minute, these ketone drinks aren't any better. Why am I buying these expensive-ass ketone drinks when I could just be eating some starches to train on? Starts to beg the question, but now we have a whole new set of supplements that are out because they're hoping that ketones are going to be a healthier, superior fuel source for certain types of physical activity with a lower risk of cancer and all these other things, but now that's not the case. So, again, a lot more research is going to need to be done, but this is kind of a death blow to the idea that ketogenic diets could be a viable form of cancer treatment. It might turn out that there's only certain types of cancer they might help with, because certain types of cancers might not be able to thrive on ketones. But now we actually have to do exhaustive studies of every single type of cancer to see what's going on there, because that's what people need to remember when we start talking about cancer or cancer cures and everything else. People are acting like all cancers are the same. Cancers behave differently when they're different type of cancer and different type of cells. They're actually different diseases in a lot of ways. It's not like all cancer automatically responds the same way to everything. Some cancer cells have a better affinity for IGF-1 than others. And now it looks like you're going to have certain cancer cells that have a higher affinity for ketones than others. And that makes this whole thing really complicated, and it makes the whole thing scary. But the upside is that they noted in the research that if we find that certain cancer cells do respond to ketones more than others, using different medications to block the creation of ketones might be the solution. That might be a way to help fight cancer, because if it turns out ketones are a major factor here, if we can block ketones from being produced in the body, then we can slow down the growth of these cancer cells. So while it's a scary thing and it does complicate the matter, it does offer new potential treatment options to be looked into. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.